Hi there, I'm Matthew Lester from the Rhodes Business School, and they've come to me to ask a very interesting question. Can the rich pay for the poor at UCKAR? Well, let's have a look at it, because I think there's a solution to this problem. It's more a question of how we go about it. So I'm going to explain a whole lot of things, and I'm going to use some of the top academic papers in the world on this, that we are looking at in the course of my deliberations on the Davis Tax Committee. Prof Matthew, the Minister of Finance, has appointed Judge Dennis Davis to look at the tax system of South Africa and overall to look at the equity of the tax system in South Africa. Working on this committee, I found things that I never knew about my country, and I'm going to have to show them to you in this presentation to try and give you an idea of the scale of the things that we are up against. Come along with me, let's see how it goes. Now, Murray Leibbrandt is an economist in Cape Town, also an Alrodian. And look how South Africa is doing. In 1948, at the start of apartheid, the top 1% of South Africa owned 20% of the income. That had actually got better by 1994. Where the top 1% only own 10% of the income. And today, well, I'm afraid we're back where we started and going south fast. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. And let's see how that affects fees must fall. Now, we all know that Nelson Mandela was a great fan of education. He's not the only one. Let's introduce somebody else into the picture, Thomas Piketty. He is now the leading economist in the world, or rated as such, with his book Capital in the 21st Century, an international bestseller. If you really want to blow your mind, try and read it. But what he's going on about in that book, we must find. And he says, to maintain a competitive edge in a rapidly transforming economy, countries need to invest more in education. Not even minimum wage can outdo it. Education and technology are the decisive factors. Why is he saying that? Well, here's a little survey on wages, and you will see that when you're at school, if you stay there, well, you're not going to earn very much. That's what a labourer earns. But along grade 8, grade 12, your earning capacity increases substantially. And that grows even further when you go to university. That's why so many people are saying, my only hope in the new South Africa is to get an education. And they're right. Now, going back to Piketty, he is saying there is a great inequality in education. Now, this is where you introduce the deciles into the debate. The deciles, each decile represents 10%. And on that graph there, you've got the poorest 10%, 0 to 10, then increasing by each 10 percentage point, landing up at 100%. And what Piketty is showing is that in the poorest decile, your chances of going to university or college, as you have it in America, is very, very slim. Going up to the richest deciles, where nearly all their children go to college and earn more. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Now imagine if we drew that graph in South Africa, it would be very difficult. Because up until the start of the fees must fall crisis, we've never looked at the incomes of parents. People have not done those surveys, they don't exist. So we can only guess at it, and I'm going to do a lot of that. But basically government policy is to say, on the poorest deciles, you must interfere and you must provide interventions such as NSFAS, where we go and fund people in education for free. Help the poorest of the poor, they say. Then we have the missing middle, or what we think is the missing middle, and they need some help as well. And then right up the top, well, they can pay their fees. In fact, we need to look and say, are we not being too generous to them? Because they are getting part of the university subsidy. And so the subsidy is helping both rich and poor. And that's a term which the Lani economists use as being regressive. It's not good news. And that's what we're on about in this debate. So we take that and then we start saying, well, what's government doing about it? And here's a survey by Klute et al. And they are showing that expenditure on higher education in South Africa is a mere 0.71% of gross domestic product. And that is far too low, and we have to say there must be something done about that. We've left it alone far too long. We've neglected the problem. So when we go into South Africa's state budgets, we can show you this. South Africa's budget consists of, we spend a fortune on basic education. The reason for that is you have a constitutional right to free basic education. But then the rest follows. We have to keep people healthy. We have to have defense, public order and police, economic affairs, local development, general public services, social protection, that's your grants and everything else. And then we have to pay interest on a never-ending increasing debt. Right at the end is that tiny little slice which goes to post-school education and training. Now that's the budget that Nzimande is on about. That's his baby. So we have to take that figure of 68 billion rand a year, less than 1% of GDP, and we've got to ask some questions. We've got to say, well, how are you actually spending this money, Mr. Nzimande? And we'll break up his budget. And then we find that the post-school education budget is split, because you have two great big chunks paid to vocational continuing education and training, and then skills development through the SETA system, which is not working. So that is taking up a third of the higher education budget. Then comes the NSFAS grants, 14 billion rand a year. Then comes the state subsidies, 24 billion rand a year. And then they've got 3 odd billion rand a year to build more universities and bits and pieces. But what we've got to say to that is some money has already been put to the cause. So this time last year, Pravin Gordhan, his predecessor, Nene, announced that an extra 16 billion rand would be allocated to education over what's called the MTBF period. That's about 5 billion rand a year, and that's been allocated to NSFAS. So the NSFAS allocation has been increased from 14 billion up to 14 billion from its previous level of 9 billion. But that's not nearly enough to deal with the problem, because what we've got on this graph is it shows, firstly, lower arrow, that tax revenue from state is growing slowly. But the subsidies paid to universities are also growing very slowly. And as we pile more and more people into the university system, that's not enough. So the universities to fill up their budget says, well, we've got nothing else to do but increase our fees. And that's basically what started your fees must fall movement. Now, when you go into the income streams of universities, you will see the effect of this over a prolonged period. Left-hand column, you've got government grants to education being nearly 50% back in 2000. Student fees being a far smaller component. And then what we call the third stream income of universities, where universities trade and get given grants and subsidies and research grants. That makes up the other third. But because of, in real terms, the decline in the government grants, the pressure put on students to pay higher and higher fees has grown and grown and grown. And the third stream income, we seem to have lost sight about that because that is not growing. So again, at the end of the day, it all comes back on the bill of the student, and the students last year reached breaking point. And this is how we've got to deal with it. So we go to the NSFAS annual report. NSFAS has been around for a few years, and in their 2014 financials, they will show you that they spent 7 billion rand and helped 186,000 students. Now the student population is about 1 million. So they've maybe helped 20%. And we hope that with the additional 5 billion rand a year that has been allocated to them by the National Treasury, that NSFAS will help 300,000 or 400,000 students in years to come. But that's still by no means ever enough. There's a hell of a lot of work that we've still got to do on this. And the students know it, and that's why they're angry. So here is the slide that's going to frighten you. Let's look at, there are South Africa's income deciles. The poorest 10% in decile 1, going up to the richest decile, decile 10. Now, In yellow are those that never get to university. It's not a fee issue, it's simply because their basic education is not strong enough to get them university admission. Isn't that quite amazing? When one looks at that, one says, my God, is that all of those people, when we go back to the earnings graph, that are condemned to have lower earnings? That is frightening. But that's another story. We're talking about those that do get to university. So then in green, we get those who are attending university, and in red, those who qualify to go to university but can't get there. Now, what do you see from that? We see that the wealthy get more people to university because they've got the money to pay for it. The wealthiest decile. Now, the question that you are asking is, couldn't we get all of those wealthy people in the 10th decile to come down and help people in the lower deciles to make it? And the way that we would do that is either by increasing the fees of the top decile or reducing their share of a state subsidy. We'd have to design a system to do that. Now that sounds great. Now let's go and crunch some numbers and see how it works. So we're saying, can we load more of the fees on the top decile? That lot there. Now we go back to Piketty. And Piketty says, I don't have an answer for you on this. Because you have such a growth in population. And although you have a very wealthy top decile, they cannot carry the whole lot. This is how it goes. Go back to a paper called Colonial Rule, Apartheid, Natural Resources, Top Incomes in South Africa, 1903 to 2007. This paper was written with the help of a South African by Anthony Atkinson. He's one of the top economists in the world. And if you want to have a story about why what happened in apartheid is still relevant today, please get your hands on that paper and study it. It's hard going, but it is really shocking stuff. And from that paper, we can find a few things. They concluded that when one looks at the top 10% income earners in South Africa, in 2007 terms, that started at an income of 80,000 rands a year. And then they followed that through and said, well, what about the top 1%? And they said that income level starts at about 400,000 rand a year. But now look at the numbers of them. The top 10%, there are 3.46 million of them. And the bottom 1%, there are only 346,000 of them. So you don't have to be very rich to be in the top end. That's the important point from this. Yes, we get some people earning staggering amounts of money. And you see there that the top 0.01% of South Africans, of which there are only 346 of them, might earn more than 10 million rand a year. But they are statistically irrelevant in the debate. We'll come back to that in a moment. So what we need to do is to now update those figures to give you a meaningful representation of what it looks like today. And it looks like this. If you earned 80,000 in 2007 and you increase that with inflation to today, you're talking about 149,000, almost 150,000. Bingo! That then matches to where NSFAS funding is cut off. And if you're in the top 400,000 in 2007 is worth 600,000 rand today. There's the point again at which we distinguish between rich and poor. So what are we saying? Deciles 1 to 9 are funded by NSFAS, and the 10th decile, that is the missing middle, or 9% of the 10th decile is the missing middle. And 1% are the extremely wealthy. So what we are saying is that for every 10 in the missing middle, there's one wealthy person in South Africa. And you and I know that one can't support 10. There's your difficulty. We don't have enough rich people in South Africa. And that's even if one wants to say that 600,000 rand is wealthy. Parents who are earning 600,000 rand a year after tax and pension deductions are earning about 400,000 rand a year take home. if it costs 100,000 Rand a year to send a child to Rhodes, they are experiencing the meaning of pain in paying university fees, even if they are paying 600,000 Rand a year. Now we've got to say, well, how many are there? And you can go into SARS Stats 2015, and this really, I've done some calculations here, where what one is really saying is that deciles 1 to 9 are still serviced by NSFAS, or meant to be serviced by NSFAS. And decile 10, well, it has from the bottom end to less of the top 1% is the missing middle, and then your ultra wealthy are 1% of South Africa. So even it all correlates using SARS stats. So let's do a little bit of national numbers here. The missing middle is looking like 1.95 million, and the wealthy are looking like 185,000. So when we take that, it's roughly 10 to 1, and we say, well, let's still put up the rate on individuals. That's working at 600,000. Why don't we say you're wealthy if you earn over 1 million? Well, there are only about 100,000 people in South Africa who earn more than 1 million Rand a year, and not many of them have children in higher education. But then comes the frightening factor. Yes, the wealthy are at South African universities, and they are getting a superbly high deal. But in all that is happening, if we now add to this that we're going to take away the wealthy's share of the subsidy, or we're going to put their fees up, they will say, thank you very much, we have alternatives. You're hearing this every day now. We're hearing, I'm going to send my kids to study overseas. How's that? We're also hearing, I'm going to send my kids to a private college, like some of the ones you see in Johannesburg. And we'll keep them away from what is happening at the universities. And the final thing that we've got to watch out for is e-learning, where we can say, kids, stay at home, we'll enroll you on internet learning, you have the devices, you have the bandwidth, why don't you teach yourself? And more young students are doing that, with a result that the income of the wealthy to universities is starting to decline. And that is not good news for anybody. We've got to try and do something about it. Now, what I've been saying to date is not giving much hope for the idea of taxing the rich. Well, look, when one looks at taxation, we've got to talk about income streams. And we've got to say, are there other income streams that we could tap into to find a quick solution to get our universities back to work? And this is my proposal. This is what I would take to Parliament on the 26th of October, the day of the medium-term budget framework speech, and I would jump up and down about this. I would say, there are all South Africa's taxes. Now we know that we're going to have a personal tax increase in South Africa irrespective of FEMA's fall. We know that the VAT rate cannot increase because it's already, COSATU have told us that we will die rather than let the VAT rate increase. The company tax rate can't increase either because of international affairs such as Brexit, and maybe that's a discussion for another day. But there's one tax that's unique, and it is directed towards skills development. And that is the Skills Development Levy. You can see it down there at the bottom of the screen. It's 17 billion Rand a year. Now let's take that tax and say it's a little bit different, because all the skills development levy that is collected is earmarked for education. It's the only tax that is specifically earmarked. And we must say, what happens there? Now, skills development levy is actually levied on employers. So employers who pay employees have to pay over 1% of payroll. And that gets 17 billion Rand a year. So now if the students campaign to say, we want 1.5% SDL levied on employers, that would get National Treasury an extra 9 billion Rand a year. Now 9 billion Rand a year is a lot of money. That would be equivalent to the entire major tax increase that we imposed on personal taxpayers at the beginning of this year, to be spread amongst everybody. Now we're saying that 9 billion Rand we want to be spent on the higher education crisis. And we can justify it to the private sector and to corporates, to saying, listen, if you don't give us that one, well, then you're going to have to face a tax increase. That amount of money, that 9 billion, would then be earmarked towards education. And then what we have to say is, we have a national state of emergency in universities. We know that. We've demonstrated that very well. Instead of throwing it into a great big pit together with the 68 billion rand that is already there under Nzimande, what should be happening is that that money should be split up and paid pro rata directly to the universities, and that the universities, subject to a guideline established by National Treasury, should decide how they are going to spend their emergency funding. So in the context of UCKAR, what we would be saying is that we're about 1% of the universities in South Africa by number, whichever way you want to measure it. If there's 9 billion in the pot, send 90 million down to roads. We'll show you how to spend it properly to get this crisis on the go. And what we've effectively done is that that money has come from the private sector without disturbing the tax system too badly. And we want to continue along that line until NSFAS and Blade and Nzimande can tell us how they are going to solve the education crisis. But we need that money in our universities now. Now that is a sustainable proposal where all business is having to contribute, which is a very different proposal from saying we want to try and isolate the wealthy when nobody really knows where they are, to try and squeeze every last cent out of them and chase them away. So what we're saying is this: a university is basically a concoction of student effort, the academic input coming from the university. But very important, and going back in the history of universities, you have to have your private sector behind the universities to provide that third stream of incomes that makes a university feasible. And then we need the government subsidies as well. By increasing the SDL rate, you are forcing the private sector back into this debate without trying to hammer away at wealthy students and just chase them away. So what are we doing with this? It's time for us to conclude. And you ask us the question, give me the future. Now, I'm not a futurist, but there is something funny about looking into the future. The further into the future you look, the more certain things become. So I can tell you that I'll be dead in 50 years' time. With almost 100% certainty, that's going to happen. And that might be a relief. But we have to take something else on a 50-year view. South Africa's population is growing by about 700,000 people per year. And National Treasury has put that in a model where they have said, if South Africa's population continues to grow at this rate, we have to create 9 million new jobs in the next 50 years, or there will be social chaos on a grand scale. And what we have to do in this crisis is affecting everybody. Because if we don't get our universities back to work, we are never going to create the numbers of jobs in South Africa that are required to get South Africa back on its feet and to hopefully deliver on everything that we've been working for. There are solutions. Hammering the rich is not going to do it, but there are a lot of other ways of getting it right. I'm Matthew Lester at the Rhodes Business School. Thank you for your attention.